It started with an inbox I wasn't supposed to see. The alias read Olin Ops Tracker, a shared system account used for internal calendar syncs, mostly overlooked by everyone except the scheduling software. No one ever manually included it in discussion threads, not unless they were rushing or careless. The message arrived at 6:42 a.m., 12 names on the thread, all senior leadership. Subject line, visibility management, pre-Q4 strategy. I didn't expect anything personal. I opened it out of habit, skimming for auto reminders. What I found instead was a paragraph that changed everything. Olivia's reputation with Alpha Core is a double-edged sword. If we give her more visibility, they'll start seeing her as the face of the company. We need to avoid that outcome. No hesitation, no context, just a decision. Another reply followed within minutes. Agreed, she's effective, but not scalable. Clients grow dependent on her. That dependency limits our leverage during renewals. They weren't discussing my performance. They were discussing containment. I sat back, hands off the keyboard, reading every word with the kind of stillness I'd only ever used in high-stakes negotiations, when the wrong response could unravel millions. I wasn't surprised, not fully. I'd felt it in the way my name disappeared from client meetings, even when I was the one holding the relationships together, in how my fixes were absorbed into someone else's presentation, in the way Marin, my boss, always thanked me in private, then promoted someone louder in public. But now it was written, not personal, not emotional, just policy. That's what I was to them, not invisible by accident, hidden by design. My name is Olivia Tran, senior strategist, at least on paper. I've been at Vantage and Konu for 10 years. I've managed over $120 million annual client contracts. I'm the one they call when a negotiation starts slipping, when a renewal stalls, when a client says, "We're thinking of going to Revel instead." I don't panic, I don't escalate, I fix things, but I don't wear the credit. I stitch it into the bottom corner where no one sees. And year after year, I was told the same thing during reviews. You're the steady hand. You're irreplaceable. You're the reason we sleep at night. Except none of that ever turned into a promotion, or a raise, or even a title adjustment. Today was my 10th review. When I walked into Marin's office at 2 p.m., he didn't look up right away. Just gestured for me to sit, eyes still on his screen. "Olivia," he said finally, "you've been phenomenal this year, again. I know we've talked about comp in the past, and I wish I had better news. But with the upcoming restructure, things are tight." I didn't speak, didn't interrupt. I just listened. He rambled through phrases. He finished with a smile. "Let's revisit this early." I stood up slowly. "No need," I said. "I've already revisited it." Then I walked out. I didn't go back to my desk. I went to a private drive I kept off network, a folder no one else could see. Inside, 10 years of escalation logs, internal strategy memos, client retention briefs, each one time-stamped, annotated, traceable to me. It was called When They Forgot Who Held It Together. I didn't send it, didn't threaten, didn't even flinch. But from that day forward, I stopped absorbing other people's mistakes. Because they weren't afraid of losing me. They were afraid clients would realize I was the only reason they stayed. I didn't leave. I didn't announce anything. But slowly, deliberately, I began pulling back the invisible threads I'd been holding for years. The first step was quiet. I stopped correcting the handoffs. When business development rushed out a scope draft without catching the legal contradiction in Clause 4.2, I didn't flag it. When Marin misquoted a client's budget ceiling in front of the CFO, I didn't follow up with a clarifying email like I usually did. I let the silence hang, let the misalignments breathe, not to sabotage, to observe. Because nothing reveals who's paying attention like the moment you stop cleaning up behind them. Within a week, minor cracks began to show. A novice shell manager forwarded a thread to the wrong distribution list. A clause error made it into the final proposal. Alpha Core requested a rollback on a deliverable, citing unclear internal alignment. None of it was catastrophic, not yet. But the rhythm, the confidence, began to shift. People started CCing me again, lightly, tentatively. Looping in Olivia for continuity. "Olivia, thoughts?" I said less. I asked questions instead of offering solutions. And when I responded, it was never to fix, only to reflect what was already happening. I wasn't stepping back. I was lowering the scaffolding and letting the building stand on its own. Some noticed. Mira from Client Success pulled me aside after a Tuesday debrief. "You've been quieter than usual," she said. "Is everything okay?" I just smiled. "Everything's operating as intended." She didn't press. Others didn't notice at all. Marin, for one, seemed relieved. He mistook my silence for compliance. He began forwarding me larger decks without asking for input, assuming I'd polish the weak points on my own time. He was preparing for a board presentation with all the conviction of a man standing on a stage built by someone else. And assuming the screws were tight, they weren't, because I had stopped tightening them. My role wasn't formalized in most of these processes. I had become such an embedded habit that no one questioned how things stayed together, only that they did. Until now. That's when the missteps began compounding. Client services escalated a scope error to legal without realizing the internal brief hadn't been updated. A junior team member repurposed a 6-month-old deck, not knowing the client had changed leadership. A renewal package went out with the wrong signatory, and in each case, I wasn't involved. Not by accident, by design. And every time someone asked, "Who was managing this stream?" the answer circled the table before landing, reluctantly, on a shrug. Olivia wasn't on that chain. Olivia wasn't in that meeting. Olivia wasn't CC'd. No one asked why, not yet, but that time would come. Because when you build quietly, you become a ghost. But when you vanish, the structure remembers what's missing. The silence began to take shape not through confrontation, but through absence. Not mine, but theirs. When I pulled back, I didn't leave a note. I didn't make a scene. I simply let the gaps appear, one at a time, quietly. The first shift came from Alpha Core. I wasn't invited to the status call. I knew it was happening. I always knew, but I no longer injected myself into meetings I wasn't officially on. That was the point. If they wanted to prove they could manage without me, I was willing to let them try. I only heard what happened afterward. Midway through the meeting, the conversation began drifting. A discussion around delivery timelines, some lingering questions about continuity. Then came the sentence Marin hadn't prepared for. "Is Olivia still with the firm?" It came from Kate. Years ago, Kate had been a junior assistant on Alpha Core's strategy team. I remembered her because she remembered things no one else did. Follow-ups, small warnings, unspoken signals. Back then, she booked rooms and cleaned up after decisions. She wasn't supposed to influence anything. Now, she was leading the conversation. And apparently, she still remembered me. Marin gave the kind of smile you can hear over a call. "Of course, Olivia's still here. She's just in more of an internal role now, focused on operations." Kate was quiet for a moment. Then she said evenly, "That's a shame. She was the reason we trusted your operations." There was no pause, no argument. They moved on, but something had shifted. Later that afternoon, I received a new calendar invite. Revised account strategy meeting, include Olivia. It didn't come from Marin. It didn't come from anyone inside. It came from Alpha Core. No commentary, no escalation, just an invitation to return. That was the first ripple. 2 days later, Navashel reached out. Not through formal channels, just a short message embedded in a long thread. Looping Olivia in, she's familiar with how we handled this before. No fanfare, no question, just expectation. They weren't asking for me. They were defaulting to me. It didn't take long before the pattern became undeniable. The more I stepped back, the more people realized where the weight had come from. Not in volume, not in presence, but in calibration, and how I'd kept chaos just quiet enough to be manageable. Meanwhile, inside our walls, Marin had begun spinning. He didn't say it, but I saw it in the way he started over-preparing, rehearsing things he never used to. Forwarding documents twice, then following up as if he were building trust through repetition. They had hired someone new, Darren, to stabilize the pipeline. Young, fast-talking, sharp with numbers. The kind of person who looks good in front of a screen, but the clients didn't know him. And worse, they didn't need to. Because when trust has a name, anything else feels temporary. One client said it clearly in post-meeting feedback. "Darren's fine, but Olivia knows how we break and how to fix it. We need that." I didn't react. I didn't show it to anyone. I just saved the comment, like I had with all the others. Because my strategy wasn't to take power back. It was to remind them what happened when they stopped respecting where it came from. I had spent years making the system feel seamless. Now I was showing them what friction felt like without me. There was a contract draft sitting in Darren's outbox. It had been there for 3 days, half complete, auto-saved, and time-stamped. I wasn't on the distribution list, but I had access to the archive folder where all versions were synced. Not because I was watching him, but because, for years, that folder had been mine. The clause he missed was small. It wasn't financial. It wasn't even operational. Just one line buried in the renewal language that no longer applied after AlphaCore's leadership restructure. But that line, obsolete, technical, seemingly harmless, invalidated the entire draft. I could have flagged it. It would have taken me 20 seconds to add a note, maybe 30 to forward the corrected language. Darren would have caught the miss, made the change, and the client would have signed by end of week. Instead, I let it sit, not out of malice, out of principle. Because every system has to learn what happens when it stops listening to its own memory. 2 days later, the signed contract came back, rejected. AlphaCore's legal team had caught the mismatch immediately. They didn't call it a mistake. They called it an unexpected inconsistency and asked to pause the renewal discussion until the scope could be clarified. It wasn't a cancellation, but it was worse. It was a freeze. Revenue deferred. Timeline stalled. Confidence quietly shaken. The thread began bouncing. Marin looped in legal looped in BD looped in operations. The entire organization began spinning, looking for the source of the fracture. And Darren? He stayed silent for 2 days. When he finally replied, he said, "I worked off the previous year's template. I assumed that was still valid." I didn't correct him. I didn't say, "You assumed wrong." I didn't tell him I had flagged that exact clause for change 9 months ago in a meeting where no one took notes. I said only, "Then the assumption needs to be documented next time. No judgment, just wait." Later that week, I saw the first visible shift in Marin. He stopped delegating, started asked if I had some bandwidth to take a second look at the Novashell deck, asked whether I had thoughts on the positioning for Bratton & Co., asked if I wanted to join the leadership sync next Friday, just as a silent observer, of course. I declined, each time politely, each time clearly. Because I didn't want to re-enter their system as a fixer, I wanted them to feel what broke when I stepped away. By now, client signals had started circling in leadership meetings. The feedback was subtle, coded in phrases like continuity risk and brand voice consistency. But underneath, the message was clear: the system no longer felt steady. Not because I left, but because they kept pretending I was never holding it up. And so I kept walking my line. No escalation, no confrontation, just an empty chair in meetings where answers used to arrive before questions were even asked. Because I didn't need to make noise. I only needed them to realize what silence feels like when the person who used to prevent collapse isn't preventing anything anymore. The call came through without warning. No calendar, no soft ping from the executive scheduler. Just a direct number flashing across my screen. Kate M., AlphaCore. For a brief second, I wondered if it was a mistake. I hadn't spoken to Kate since the transition, when AlphaCore rotated their team and left most communication to Marin's group. Back then, she had been assisting their VP of strategy, always courteous, always precise. I remembered how she once stayed 15 minutes after a meeting just to verify a sentence in a footnote I'd edited. She didn't miss things, and clearly she hadn't missed my absence. I answered the call with the same composure I'd learned to use in crisis negotiations. Olivia Tran. She didn't waste time. Her voice was calm but direct, measured in the way people speak when they already know the answer. "Are you free this Thursday?" Before I could ask for context, she clarified, "I want you in the room for our strategy review. Not Marin, not the delivery team, you." There was no hesitation in her tone, no space for diplomacy, just a decision already made. I replied carefully, "I'm not the account lead anymore." Her response was steady, almost cold. "You never needed the title. You were the reason things stayed intact." The call lasted 14 minutes. She didn't try to persuade me, and I didn't try to defer. But by the time we hung up, it was clear the shift had begun. This wasn't an escalation, it was realignment, and I hadn't initiated it. That same afternoon, Marin messaged me. The tone tried for casual, but the pressure sat between every word. "Hey, heard AlphaCore wants you back in scope. Totally fine from my side. Just want to make sure we're aligned before anything's formalized." He wasn't checking in. He was trying to regain control of something that was no longer his to manage. And he wasn't the only one feeling it. A day later, legal forwarded a draft clause from Novashell's compliance team. It was nothing major, a language review from an older document, but buried in the replies, someone had asked, Would Olivia be the best person to clarify this? She used to write these. No tag, no CC, just a name, dropped plainly, without effort, like it was obvious, because to them, it was. I didn't chase it, I didn't step in, I let the request sit, and by the time someone else responded, the clients had already paused their approval cycle. Then Bratton and Coe followed. They submitted a restructure brief, routine on the surface, except for the line at the bottom. If Olivia isn't part of this conversation, we're happy to wait until she is. No ultimatum, no justification, just a quiet redirection of power. I watched it happen in real time, not like a coup, not like a firestorm, but like oxygen slipping from the room. Marin's messages grew more frequent, more deferential. He started looping me in too early, asking questions he used to answer himself. He was no longer managing the relationship. He was chasing it, and I remained still, because I didn't need to fight for space. I had already created it years ago through the way I listened, the way I executed, the way I refused to play politics and delivered what mattered anyway. Now the clients were speaking in the only language leadership understands: preference. And for the first time, that preference had a name: mine. Marin started arriving to meetings earlier than usual. He carried printed decks, something he used to dismiss as outdated, and kept repeating key points as if frequency could replace authority. He sent summary emails after calls that didn't need them. He started CCing people higher up, including names that didn't belong in the room. He was trying to be seen, which meant something had shifted. When a leader starts performing their role instead of inhabiting it, you don't need to guess who they're performing for. The clients had gone quiet again, but it wasn't disengagement. It was calculation. They had voiced their preference, and now they were watching the consequences unfold. Not because they wanted drama, but because they wanted proof. The breaking point came with the Bratton account. A QBR deck Marin had assembled on his own, meant to reassure the client of continuity, landed with a thud. The slide structure was hollow, the metrics misaligned. Worse, it referenced an outdated benchmark from 2 fiscal cycles ago, one that had already been challenged and revised in writing. Bratton's CFO didn't respond during the meeting. He waited until the end, then said flatly, "This doesn't reflect the last 18 months. Who reviewed this?" There was a pause. Marin answered with a smile too polished to be natural. "Our strategy ops team drafted the base, but I structured the narrative." The CFO nodded slowly. Then he looked down, closed his notebook, and said only, "That explains it." 3 days later, a message landed in the CEO's inbox. Not a complaint, not a threat, just a question from Bratton's executive liaison. "Is Olivia Tran still with the firm?" That's when it became visible. When a client asks about an individual by name, in writing, at that level, it signals one thing: that your system is misaligned with your value. It took less than 12 hours for the request to trickle back down. The CEO forwarded the message to Marin, ceasing HR with a single sentence: "Please clarify the status of her involvement with all 3 top-tier accounts." I wasn't copied, but I didn't need to be. I heard it in the way HR pinged me for a quick role clarification. I felt it in the way legal asked for access to my archived retention notes they had ignored for years. That week, I received a calendar invite from the CEO's chief of staff. Subject line: informal strategy touchpoint, Olivia T. No details, no prep document, just a time. And that was when I understood something deeper than revenge. I hadn't forced the unraveling. I'd only stopped holding the knots. It was never personal, it was structural. They built an entire framework on the assumption that I would keep absorbing their weight, smoothing their faults, and fixing their oversights, without needing credit or visibility. But the moment I stopped doing it, the moment I let the machine run exactly as it had been designed without me, it began to rattle. Not because it was broken, but because I had been the balance they refused to acknowledge. And now, even the people at the top wanted to know what had shifted. Because things were still standing, but nothing felt steady anymore. The invitation was framed as informal, a 30-minute touchpoint with the CEO, scheduled quietly on a Friday morning before anyone else had arrived on the floor. There was no agenda attached, no assistant waiting in the hall, just a silent calendar block and a conference room I hadn't stepped into in over a year. When I entered, the CEO, Daniel Reese, was already seated. He didn't stand, didn't shake my hand, just gestured to the seat across from him and said, "Olivia, sit." He spoke like someone who had already read the ending. and now wanted to know how we got there. "I've been reviewing a few things," he said, tapping the side of his tablet. "Bratton, AlphaCore, Novashell, in the last quarter, all three accounts have either paused expansions or shifted requests. And all three have mentioned you unprompted." I didn't respond. He didn't expect me to. He slid the tablet across the table. On the screen was a note forwarded from Bratton's CFO. "We remain open to re-engagement pending Olivia Tran's involvement." Daniel leaned back. "You're not listed as lead on any of them. In fact, according to our systems, you're barely on record at all. And yet—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. I knew what he was circling. Visibility and value rarely live in the same column until the gap between them becomes a cost. He folded his hands, studying me now. "So I'm going to ask something blunt. Were you sidelined, or did you step back?" I held his gaze, calm, clear. "Both," I said. "They stopped seeing me, I stopped correcting them." There was a long pause, not hostile, just precise. Daniel exhaled once, then nodded. "I've known Marin a long time," he said. "He's loyal, he's delivered results, but lately he's been showing signs I don't like. Defensive language, too many qualifiers, a growing pattern of mistaking presence for control." He let that hang for a beat. "I don't want to micromanage leadership, but I also can't afford to lose 3 anchor clients because we failed to recognize where the trust was anchored." Still, I said nothing, because this wasn't the part where I made demands. It was the part where I let them do the math. Daniel leaned forward now, elbows on the table, voice quieter. "I need to understand one thing, Olivia. Have we lost you already?" The question wasn't dramatic, it was practical, and so was my answer. "No, but I stopped offering what wasn't acknowledged, and when the clients noticed, I let them ask the question you just asked." He absorbed that, slowly, thoughtfully. Then he reached for the tablet again, scrolled, and spoke more like a strategist than an executive. "We're restructuring strategic ops. I'd like your input on how it should actually work. No titles, just architecture, if you're willing." It wasn't a bribe. It wasn't even flattery. It was the beginning of a concession. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I stood, thanked him for the conversation, and left the room. But as I walked down the hallway, I passed Marin, pacing outside, feigning a phone call. His voice dipped when he saw me. Then he turned away. Because in systems like ours, downfall never comes with a bang. It starts when the person they erased walks back in without needing permission. By Monday morning, the shift had a name: Strategic Realignment, Phase 1. That's what the memo said. No press release, no restructure chart, just a one-line note from the CEO sent to senior staff. Effective immediately, Olivia Tran will advise directly on all client-facing stabilization strategies across AlphaCore, Bratton & Coheney, and Novashell. All relevant teams will collaborate accordingly. It didn't use the word promotion. It didn't use the word reinstatement. It didn't need to. Because in the kind of organization we had, titles were slow currency, but visibility, that was velocity. And overnight, everything accelerated. Slack channels that once excluded me were renamed. Legal threads I hadn't seen in years were forwarded back. Junior staff began asking cautiously if I had recommendations. Even HR, usually the last to react, requested a role scope alignment, citing compliance. Marin stayed quiet, at least in public. He didn't contest the memo, didn't challenge the new workflows. He just started showing up to fewer meetings, offering fewer summaries, and eventually withdrawing behind a wall of focus time blocks on his calendar. But the part that told me the collapse was complete came 3 weeks later. Bratton scheduled a live review, CEO to CEO. Daniel asked if I would join. I said I would attend, but only to listen. During the meeting, Bratton's lead executive spoke directly to our side. "We've been reviewing the last 18 months, he said. "There were periods where the signal got fuzzy, too many layers, too much choreography. But when Olivia re-entered the conversation, the alignment returned almost immediately." He paused, then turned slightly toward Daniel. "We're not asking for guarantees, but we're clear on this. Whatever structure you finalize, we need her at the table." Daniel nodded once, and that was it. No arguments, no reshuffling, no need to prove anything further. Because it wasn't just that I had returned, it was that the system functioned better when I stopped asking to be let in and started acting as if I'd never left. From that day, all 3 major accounts were restructured under a new model, one where I didn't report into anyone. I advised across, autonomously, strategically, without gatekeeping. And Marin? Within the quarter, he requested a transitional sabbatical. The message was phrased delicately, citing burnout and the need to rebalance. But everyone knew the truth. He hadn't lost his job, he'd lost his role, because control is never about headcount. It's about trust. And once trust flows around you instead of through you, you're no longer in charge. I didn't celebrate his departure, didn't comment on the irony. I just kept building the system I was once asked to stay behind. But this time, in full view. I didn't redesign the structure to favor myself. That would have been too easy and too short-lived. Instead, I looked for the silences, the gaps where people like me used to exist, working under someone else's name, cleaning up someone else's promise, delivering results that no one dared to trace back. And I rewrote how those roles were defined. No more strategic coordinator with no decision rights, no more client stabilizer buried 2 layers under account leads, no more invisibility sold as humility. The first thing I did was dismantle the middle filters, the vague bloated layer of management that absorbed credit and deflected blame. It wasn't personal, it was structural. No one fought back directly. They couldn't, because every change I made was backed by 10 years of evidence they had never looked at and now couldn't afford to ignore. I created a role called Strategic Continuity Owner, not a title for show, a role with teeth. Each person in it would hold direct decision access to the accounts they managed. Not on behalf of, not in collaboration with, but as themselves. If a client said your name in the room, you belonged in that room. I didn't fill the roles from the top of the ladder. I filled them from memory. Mira, who used to quietly fix back-end logistics without being asked, was the first name I pulled. She'd never spoken over anyone, but every time I watched her step into a crisis, she brought clarity with a single sentence. Now, she owns 3 accounts I used to anchor. I didn't warn her, I just sent her the client brief, the budget, and the mandate. She came to my desk a day later. "You're sure?" I looked up. "You've already done it for 5 years. I'm just removing the part where someone else took the call." She didn't smile, she nodded, and that was enough. One by one, I picked the people who had been operating from the edges. Those who hadn't lobbied for spotlight, but whose names always came up when the fire stopped. Not all of them were obvious. Some had been dismissed by HR as too reserved, not leadership material, but results leave residue, and I had tracked enough of it to know who built what. I didn't bring back the old model. I built a new one that didn't need my shadow, because real legacy isn't about staying in charge. It's about making sure no one else has to disappear to be essential again. By the end of the quarter, client satisfaction had stabilized, turnover slowed, and for the first time in a decade, the word irreplaceable disappeared from internal reviews. No one needed to be irreplaceable anymore, because the system finally acknowledged who was holding it up before it was too late. I never changed my title. I never asked for one. I still sat at the same desk, 3rd row, south wing, facing the window that overlooked the parking structure. Nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic, but I noticed the way people paused near it now. The way newer staff glanced sideways before asking a question, like they were checking whether the ground was still steady. Eventually, the invitation stopped surprising me. The CEO began looping me in less, not because I was irrelevant, but because the system had stabilized enough that I didn't need to mediate every judgment. Mira handled a Bratton escalation without flinching. Darren, who had fumbled a year ago, rewrote the Alpha Core brief with precision. Not because someone coached him, but because he finally had space to learn without pretending to know. Marin never returned. His sabbatical quietly became permanent. A few people asked, most didn't. There was no announcement, just a reshuffled org chart and a footnote about strategic evolution. I didn't comment, I didn't gloat. Some endings don't need punctuation. And me, I stayed exactly where I was until the day I decided I didn't have to. I didn't make a speech, didn't leave a memo, just submitted my transition plan and set every handoff to go directly to the people who had already been doing the work. The ones I had pulled forward, the ones I had taught how to hold the weight without waiting for permission. The CEO called me in before I left. "Are you sure?" he asked. "We've finally built what you deserved all along." I met his eyes steady. "That's why I can leave. Legacy isn't what stays with your name. It's what survives without it." When I walked out that final time, no one clapped, no farewell cake, no inbox blast. But 3 weeks later, Alpha Core called. They didn't ask for me, they asked for Mira. And that's how I knew. The system had finally caught up to the truth I carried quietly for 10 years. Now it belonged to someone else, exactly as it should.